I read an interesting article the other day on the Boxing News 24 website called Mike Tyson, Gennady Golovkin and the Myth of the Indestructible Boxer. If you want to read it, go onto the site and I'm sure you'll find it from there. And it put Mike Tyson and Gennady Golovkin in the same breath in that they said they looked very good against lower level opposition, but when they moved up in class, they were exposed, if you like, or didn't look as good. And I think the example that the article used for Mike Tyson was when he fought Quick James Tillis. Now that was a fight that Mike Tyson won. It was the first of Mike Tyson's fights, I believe, to go the distance, but there was a knockdown early in the fight, but James Tillis saw it through to the end. Now Tillis, when you watch that fight, he didn't fight to win. I think he was fighting to survive, and you see him frustrating Mike Tyson with the use of the jab, movement, and really smothering Mike Tyson's offense. When Mike Tyson came in, you saw him just tying him up and pushing him away and being quite physical with him. As I say, using his tall range and his distance and his strength. So that's essentially what it was all about. Now, I personally think that Mike Tyson was one of the best heavyweights of all time. I put him in my top 5, but this is not about Mike Tyson, so we'll leave that post for another time. But I thought Mike Tyson was awesome in his prime years between 85 and 1989, in my opinion. But like I said, this post isn't really about that. It's about Gennady Golovkin and Mike Tyson and the use of the word hype job. Now, as I said, it pretty much says the same about Gennady Golovkin, that when he fights lower level opposition, he's going to look awesome. But when he moves up in class, he's going to get exposed. But I don't think you can really say that, because if you think about it, if you're fighting somebody who's not on the same level as you, and of course you're going to look good. When you're fighting somebody who is on roughly the same par, it's going to look more difficult, isn't it? So it's an obvious thing. But, you know, you can't completely disregard Golovkin's performances, because he's done well so far and he's beat whoever's been put in front of him. And you know, I think they were referring to the Daniel Jacobs fight, because interestingly, they never really mentioned Gennady Golovkin being overly hyped up until the Jacobs fight. Now, there were a lot of people before the Jacobs fight, and even now, who think that Gennady Golovkin is overrated. But it was interesting that this article happened to come out after the Daniel Jacobs fight. But in my opinion, look, he's allowed to have a bad day at the office, isn't he? For one, I don't consider it a bad day at the office, but essentially he is allowed to have a bad day at the office. If he wants to fight a different way, more use of the jab, play it a little bit more safe, he can do that. If he wants the fight to go over the distance, he can do that. If he wants to fight a bit more reserved, he's able to do that. It doesn't necessarily make him less of a fighter or expose him in any way, shape or form. I mean, look, Daniel Jacobs fought very well. When I first watched the fight, I gave it to Jacobs, but I watched the fight 3 times in total, and I've given it to Gennady Golovkin. So I think that he done enough to win the fight, and I think he won it with his use of the jab. If they fought again, I think that if Gennady Golovkin forces the issue, he could get the stoppage. But nonetheless, I thought it was a great performance by Jacobs, so all credit to him. But you've got to give credit to Gennady Golovkin. He's beat whoever's been put in front of him. He took some good shots against Jacobs, albeit Brook was much lighter. He took some great shots from Brook, and he overcome that adversity. You know, he took those shots and he still did what he had to do to win the fight. So obviously when he moves up in class, it's going to be less convincing, his wins, but in some cases, but he still got the job done, and we've got to give him credit and props for that. But the interesting thing that I wanted to talk about was this whole issue of exposure. I don't think that Gennady Golovkin was exposed in the Daniel Jacobs fight. Like I said before, he fought a different fight. Styles make fights. Anything can happen. You know, it's not something that we should beat him up about, because, you know, every fight is different. Styles make fights. That style might have been particularly awkward for Golovkin. Obviously, guys that use movement are going to make it hard for anyone, and they're difficult to nail and hold down. But I just really want to talk about this whole concept of, you know, the hype job, you know, and the people saying that Gennady Golovkin is a hype job. And you know what? I'm inclined to agree. But to be honest, I think hype jobs are actually good for the sport of boxing, because it gets casual fans and the non-hardcore boxing fans interested in boxing. Because if you build up a fighter to the point where you portray them as this indestructible fighter, this punching machine, a granite chin, can fight, has never lost, people are going to want to watch that fighter, and it generates interest in the sport. So I like hyping up fighters like Gennady Golovkin because it excites people. The only downside might be that when you actually watch them fight, it might turn out to be disappointing, and they might be like, well, what was all the hype about? But generally speaking, hyping up fighters is very good. But what I wanted to say about this whole hype job thing is that my interpretation of what a hype job is, when I use the term, what I mean is that there's a lot of hype surrounding a fighter before he's necessarily proved himself. When I say a hype job, I don't mean this person can't fight. I'm just saying that they're giving him a lot more recognition than what he deserves at the present time. So Anthony Joshua, for example, is a perfect example of somebody who is a blatant hype job. Can he fight? Of course. Is he agile? Of course. Can he box? Yes. Is he powerful? Of course he is. But a lot of people are saying he's the best heavyweight since Muhammad Ali, but he hasn't fought anybody. So how can you give him that title? Mike Tyson, of course he was a hype job. GGG is a hype job. Errol Spence is a hype job. So you can't, necessarily say these guys can't fight, but I don't think you should give them this particular what's the word? This particular crown and label them the best fighter since sliced bread when they haven't necessarily proved that. Now, Gennady Golovkin is a lot more proven than Anthony Joshua, so we can't say that about him. But a lot of hype surrounds certain fighters and they haven't necessarily proved it. But I think it can be good and bad for the game, more good than bad in my opinion. Now this really is also a post about Errol Spence versus Kell Brook, because this is another example of a hype job situation where everybody is saying that Kell Brook is going to get pummeled by Errol Spence. And I think what kind of disappoints me about some of the things I've been hearing is that a lot of these people who I've heard aren't necessarily like hardcore boxing fans who watch boxing, who study boxing, and who watch fighters from the beginning, the early days. These guys who are going around saying that Errol Spence is gonna annihilate Kell Brook haven't necessarily followed him or studied him, but they're buying into the hype. So unless you really know your boxing and you're a boxing fanatic and you've assessed Kell Brook's strengths and weaknesses and you've assessed Spence's strengths and weaknesses, and you can come to an informed decision about who you think is going to win the fight, then you can make that kind of a prediction or assumption. But if you are just buying into the hype and saying, Spence is going to kill him, without necessarily studying or watching him, then I think that's wrong. And I think a lot of people do that, and that's what really annoys me. I personally think that, Kell Brook versus Errol Spence is going to be a tough fight. I think that it's a 50-50 fight. I think that Errol Spence is a great fighter. I think, he's, when I say great, I don't mean he is a great. I think he's a great fighter. But I think so is Kell Brook. And I think it's genuinely a 50-50 fight. And I think Kell Brook is going to look to control the fight from the outside. And I think Errol Spence is going to want to come on the inside. And I think it will be dangerous for Brook if that happens. But I'm not calling it. It's genuinely a 50-50 fight. I mean, the best performance we've seen of Errol Spence is when he fought Chris Algieri. He was able to do something that Manny Pacquiao and Amir Khan couldn't do, and that was to stop him in emphatic fashion. But anyway, look, that's my view on the Gennady Golovkin hype job situation and the Errol Spence hype job situation, and the fight coming up against Kell Brook. I think it's a 50-50 fight that you can't actually call. And, I think we shall see what happens when they fight. I think it's 20th of May in Sheffield. I'm gunning for my UK boy, and I hope he pulls it off. And it's another fight to look forward to. Anyway, let me know your comments in the section below, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks.